A church full of people laughs at a widow's coat, and a millionaire cattleman in the last pew hears every note of it. That coat has been mended 11 times. She is not a woman that so much as owns a coat. Perhaps she might sit nearer the door, where the draft would not trouble the rest of us. Her 9-year-old daughter hears it too, and turns around to see who is laughing, and finds out it is everyone. The cattleman says nothing through the sermon. He says nothing through the second hymn. Then the collection plate starts down the aisle, and he stands up in the back of that church holding a book nobody in the building has seen in 6 years. And by the time he sits back down, the man who runs that congregation has lost everything he has, and every pew in the room has stopped belonging to the people who paid for it. Skiz to Brave West before we start. And tell me down in the comments what part of the world you're watching from today. I read every single one, and it never stops amazing me how far these old prairie stories reach. The Pilot Grove Union Church stood on the north edge of a Kansas town that had 211 people in it in the autumn of 1879, and it was, without any argument, the finest building for 60 miles in any direction. That is a strange thing to say about a small frame church, so let me tell you why it was true. Western Kansas in the 1870s had almost no wood. That is the fact that shapes everything about this story. There is no timber on that ground worth the name. A cottonwood along a creek, some scrub willow, and after that, you are looking at grass in every direction until the curve of the earth takes it away from you. People out there built with sod because sod was what there was. They built with sod and they roofed with sod, and they lived in houses that were, in every honest sense, holes in the ground with a stovepipe. So when the settlers of Pilot Grove decided in 1873 that they were going to have a real church, a frame church, with sawn lumber and a shingle roof and glass in the windows, and a steeple you could see from 4 miles out, they were not deciding to build a building. They were deciding to haul a forest across 91 miles of open prairie, one wagon at a time, from the nearest railhead, in a country with no road. It took them 3 years, and the man who hauled most of it was named Ephraim Ames. Ephraim Ames was a freighter. He owned 4 yoke of oxen and a heavy Studebaker wagon with a false bed, and in the ordinary run of things he made his living carrying goods out to the settlements from the railhead and carrying hides and bone back. He was 34 years old in 1873. He had a wife named Hannah, and by the end of it, a daughter named Josie. When the church subscription opened in the spring of 1873, Ephraim Ames could not put in money. He did not have money. Almost nobody in that county had money in 1873, because that was the year the whole country went into a panic, and the price of everything a farmer could grow fell through the floor. What he had was oxen and a wagon and time, so he subscribed labor. He put his name in the book, and beside it he wrote in his own hand that he would haul the lumber, all of it, free, every board, every shingle, every keg of nails, every pane of glass, 91 miles each way, on his own animals at his own cost, for as long as it took. He made 22 round trips. I want to be precise about what that means, because it is easy to hear a number like that and let it slide past. 91 miles out and 91 miles back with a loaded wagon and ox teams is a 14-day round trip in good weather. He did it 22 times over 3 years. He wore out 2 wagons. He lost 3 oxen, 1 to a broken leg in a prairie dog hole, and 2 to a lightning strike on the Smoky Hill Divide in July of 1875. He paid for the replacements himself, and he never sent a bill to anyone. Hold that number in your head, because 22 trips comes back at the very end of this in a way I promise you are not expecting. And if you want more stories like this one, tap the like button and hit subscribe. 1 tap each. It is the whole reason I get to keep making these. The Pilot Grove Union Church was raised and dedicated on the 4th of June, 1876. Ephraim Ames died 14 months later, in August of 1877, of a burst appendix at the age of 38, in a sod house 9 miles from town, with a doctor 4 hours away who arrived at 10 in the evening and could do absolutely nothing. He left his wife Hannah a quarter section of hard ground, a plow, 1 surviving yoke of oxen, and a daughter who was 7 years old. He also left her a coat. It was a wool freighter's coat, brown, double-breasted, cut long enough to cover a man's knees on a wagon box. Hannah Ames took it in at the shoulders and shortened the sleeves in the winter of 1877, and she wore it every cold day for the rest of her life. And by the autumn of 1879, that coat had been mended 11 separate times. She could have told you where every one of them was. The tear at the left elbow from a wagon bolt, the burn on the right cuff from the stove, the 2 places along the bottom hem, where the wool had simply given out from wear and she had backed it with linsey from an old dress. The patch on the left breast, which was the biggest one and the one everybody saw, cut from the good part of a wool blanket in a brown that did not match and never would 11 men's. she was not ashamed of a single one of them. That is the thing to understand about Hannah Ames before we go any further. She was not a woman creeping around a town hoping nobody noticed her. She was a woman who had buried a husband and kept a quarter section under crop with a 9-year-old and 1 yoke of oxen. And she walked into that town on a Sunday morning with her chin up in a coat with 11 patches on it because the coat was warm, and it had been his, and the alternative was to stay home. Now, here is the other half of the machine, and this is the part that most people have never heard of, so stay with me. That church had a debt. Of course it had a debt. You do not haul a forest 91 miles and buy glass and shingles and a bell out of a Kansas county in the 1870s without borrowing something. The Pilot Grove Union Church had been raised on Ephraim Ames's oxen and on $1,100 of borrowed money, taken from a loan and trust company in Topeka in 1875, secured against the building and the lot, at 10%. By the autumn of 1879, there was $640 still standing against it. And the way that congregation paid the interest, and the way about a third of the churches on that frontier paid their interest, was pew rent. If you have never come across it, here is how pew rent worked. The pews in the church were numbered. Once a year, usually in the autumn, the trustees held a letting, and a family paid an annual rent for the right to sit in a particular pew. The front pews and the pews nearest the stove cost the most. The back pews and the ones by the door cost the least. A family that paid held that pew, and their name went on a card slipped into a brass frame screwed to the end of it. And nobody else sat there. It was not a scandal. It was ordinary and it was legal, and it was how a great many congregations in this country funded themselves. And plenty of good people defended it on the sensible grounds that a building costs money and somebody has to pay for it. But look at what it does. It takes the one room in a frontier town where a person's worth is not supposed to be measured in money. And it puts a price on every square foot of the floor, and it prints your price on a card and screws it to the end of the bench so that everyone can read it on their way past. Stay with me here, because in about 10 minutes I am going to tell you exactly what was written in the original subscription book of that church, and what one man did to it with a pen, and it is the whole hinge of this story. If you are with me so far, tap the like button. One tap. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who ought to hear them. The man who held the pew letting, and who kept the subscription book, and who had kept both since 1873, was named Cyrus Bell. Deacon Bell was 58 in 1879. He had come out from Ohio in 1871 with more capital than anybody else on that town site, and he had put a good deal of it into the church, and he was, by every measure a town uses, the leading citizen of Pilot Grove. He owned the elevator. He held the note on 4 farms. He had given $410 in cash toward the building, which was more than any other single subscriber by a factor of 3. He was not a hypocrite in the simple way. He did believe. He was in that building 3 times a week, and he had knelt on that floor at 2 in the morning during the grasshopper year, alone, and prayed like a drowning man. Anybody who tells you the villain of this story did not believe in God has not thought about it hard enough. What Cyrus Bell believed, underneath all of it, was that a man standing before heaven and a man standing in a ledger tended to run in the same direction. That prosperity was a sign. That the man who could give $410 had probably been given $410 for a reason, and the woman who could give nothing had probably arrived at nothing for a reason too. It is a very old idea, and it is very comfortable if you are the one on top of it. The pew letting for the year 1879 was held on the 5th of October. Pew 1 through 4, nearest the stove, went at $4 the year. Pews 5 through 9, $3. 10 through 14, $2. The last 3 rows by the door in the draft, $1. Hannah Ames could not pay $1. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not self-pity. In October of 1879 she had $11 and change in a tin in the wall of a sod house, and it was earmarked, every cent of it, for seed wheat, and there was no second source of money on that place until harvest. And the difference between putting seed in the ground and not putting seed in the ground was the difference between eating in 1880 and not eating in 1880. So she went to Deacon Bell on the 6th of October and asked whether she and Josie might sit in the back without renting. And Cyrus Bell said yes. He said yes. I want that on the record because it is more interesting than if he had said no. He said, "Of course, Mrs. Ames. Nobody is turned from this house. Sit where there's room." Which sounds like grace. And it was, a little. And it also meant that for the whole autumn of 1879, Hannah Ames and her daughter came in every Sunday and sat wherever nobody had paid to sit, which meant they sat in a different place every week, which meant that every Sunday morning the entire congregation watched a widow and a child stand in the aisle and look for a bench with no name card on it. 52 times a year, a town got to watch a woman find out where she was allowed to be. And on the 9th of November, 1879, they ran out of room. It was a cold morning, 30 degrees at daybreak with a north wind, and it was the Sunday after the first snow. And every family in that county was in that building because there was nothing else to do, and the church had the only stove in town anybody was welcome at. Every rented pew was full, every one of them. Hannah and Josie Ames came in at 4 minutes past 10 with the wind behind them. They stood at the back of the aisle, and they looked, and there was no bench with an empty stretch on it that did not have a name card in a brass frame at the end. Josie Ames was 9 years old. She was holding her mother's hand, and she was wearing a knit hood and a pair of her father's wool socks pulled up over her stockings under her boots, and she did not entirely understand what was happening, only that they were standing up, and everyone else was sitting down, and it was taking a long time. Somebody could have moved over. That is the thing I want to sit on for a second. There were 110 people in that building. Any one of them could have slid 18 inches to the left. A rented pew was not a locked door. Nobody in the Pilot Grove Union Church was under any instruction, from heaven or from the trustees, to sit tight and let a widow stand. And for about 40 seconds nobody moved. Not out of cruelty. Out of the ordinary, everyday, appalling human habit of waiting to see what everybody else is going to do. Then Mrs. Louisa Sprague, who had pew number $3-4 the year, nearest the stove, turned halfway around in her seat and said, in the carrying whisper of a woman who wants to be heard and wants to be able to say she was only whispering, perhaps she might sit nearer the door. The draft would not trouble her. She has that coat. The woman beside her made a sound. It was not a laugh exactly. It was that short, breathy, tucked-in noise people make in a solemn room when they are not allowed to laugh, and it is worse than laughing, because it is a laugh with a lid on it, and everybody can hear it straining. And then it spread. That is the part Josie Ames remembered when she was 80 years old, and she wrote it down in 1951 in a county historical pamphlet, and that is how we know the shape of that morning at all. Is dull. She wrote that she turned around to see who was laughing, and she wrote, I could not find one face. It was the room. Somebody in the third row said, quite audibly, it's been mended 11 times, I've counted. Somebody else said the words, a Christian coat. There was that dry rustle of 100 people enjoying something together, which is a sound anybody who has ever been on the wrong end of it never forgets as long as they live. Hannah Ames stood in the aisle of the church her husband had hauled from the ground up, in his coat, and let it happen. She did not turn and walk out. People always ask that. She did not walk out because it was 30 degrees, because her daughter's boots were thin, because home was 9 miles, and because if she walked out of that building on that morning she was never going to be able to walk back into it, and she knew that in the front of her mind while it was happening. So she took Josie's hand and she went to the very back, to the last row on the left, the draft row, the $1 row, where the Cobb family sat and where there were 14 inches free at the end of the bench. And she sat down on 14 inches with a 9-year-old on her lap. The organ started. The congregation stood for the opening hymn, and in the very last pew on the right alone, a man who had come in 11 minutes earlier and sat down at the back the way a stranger does, put both hands on the rail in front of him and did not stand up. His name was Elias Ward, and he was not passing through. He was 55 years old. He ran cattle on leased Cherokee stripgrass and deeded ground in 3 Kansas counties. He had a half interest in a commission house at the Kansas City stockyards. And since 1878 he had held a controlling share in a Topeka bank that had done something that autumn which is going to matter a great deal in about 6 minutes. It had bought paper. Here is the thing about western Kansas in 1879 that people do not think about when they picture it. That country ran on Eastern money. A loan and trust company in Topeka or Lawrence would lend to farmers and towns and congregations out on the line at 10 and 12%, and then it would bundle that paper up and sell it on to banks and investors who wanted a better return than they could get in Boston. Thousands of small Western mortgages moved that way every year. Most of the people who owed on them never knew who actually held the note, and most of the men who held the notes had never laid eyes on the security. Elias Ward was not most men. When his bank took up a block of Kansas paper in September of 1879, he did a thing his own directors thought was a waste of 6 weeks. He got on a horse and went and looked at it. He had been out on that line for 19 days. He had looked at 4 farms, a grain elevator, a school district bond, and a flour mill with a cracked wheel. And on the 9th of November he came into Pilot Grove to look at the last item in the block, which was $640 standing against a frame church. And because it was Sunday morning and the building was in use, he did what any sensible man does. He went inside and sat at the back and waited for the service to be over. He brought his saddlebag in with him, because it was 30 degrees out and there was nothing in that town to leave a bag in, and in that saddlebag was the whole file. That is the accident this entire story hangs on, and I am not going to dress it up as anything else. Elias Ward did not ride into Pilot Grove carrying justice in a leather bag. He rode in carrying paperwork, on a routine errand, on the one morning in 6 years when it happened to matter. Now let me tell you what was in that file, because Elias Ward had read it 4 nights earlier in a hotel in Ellsworth with nothing else to do. When the trustees of the Pilot Grove Union Church borrowed $1,100 in 1875, the Loan and Trust Company in Topeka did what those companies always did with a congregation. It asked for evidence that the community actually stood behind the building. A church is poor security. You cannot foreclose a congregation. What the lender wanted to see was that the people of that place had put something real into it, because people fight to keep what they have put something real into. So the trustees sent in the subscription book, the original one, the one opened in the spring of 1873, in a sod schoolhouse with 41 names in it, each in the subscriber's own hand where the subscriber could write, and in a witness's hand where he could not. It went to Topeka in 1875 as an exhibit, and it was filed with the note, and it never came back, because nothing filed with a note in Topeka ever came back to a town like Pilot Grove. And on the 11th page of that book, in a heavy, careful, slow hand with the letters shaped by a man who did not write often and was determined to do it properly, was this: Ames, have no money to give. Will haul the lumber. All of it from the road at Ellis, free on my own teams, till the house is up or I am dead. Elias Ward had read that in a hotel room in Ellsworth on the 5th of November, and it had stopped him for a minute, the way a thing like that will, and then he had turned the page and gone on with the file. Because there was a second document in that file. There was the dedication roll. In June of 1876, when the church was finished, the trustees had a roll of honor made. It was written out fair in a professional hand by a stationer in Hayes. It listed the subscribers to the building fund, and it was framed under glass and hung on the wall of the vestibule of the Pilot Grove Union Church, where every single person who came through that door passed within 2 feet of it, 52 Sundays a year. There were 31 names on the dedication roll. There had been 41 names in the subscription book. The 10 that were missing were the 10 men who had subscribed labor instead of money. The 2 who dug the footings. The one who quarried and hauled the stone for the piers. The one who did the plastering. The one who gave a year of his own carpentry. And the freighter who made 22 round trips of 182 miles, and buried 3 oxen on the way. Cyrus Bell had made that roll. He had made it himself, decided what went on it, and paid the stationer $4 out of his own pocket to letter it. And when a man in Ellsworth in 1879 laid the subscription book and the dedication roll side by side on a hotel bed, the logic of it was not even hidden. The roll was a money document. It ran in descending order of contribution, from Cyrus Bell at $410 down to a widow named Pruden at $1.50. And a man who had given no money at all simply had nowhere to stand on a list like that. There is a way of erasing a person that requires no malice whatsoever. You just build a list that has no column he fits in. Josie Ames walked past that frame every Sunday of her childhood. She could read by the time she was 6. She read those 31 names the way children read anything that is at eye level and always there over and over without meaning to. She never once found her father. She asked her mother about it when she was 8. And Hannah Ames, who could have said a great many things, said this: "The house is the roll, Josie. He's in the walls." That was true, and it was not enough. And Hannah Ames knew it was not enough on the day she said it. If this story has hold of you, do me one favor before we get to the collection plate, because what happens in the next few minutes is the reason people in that county were still telling this in 1951. Hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is the only thing that keeps stories like this one coming. The service on the 9th of November 1879 ran an hour and 10 minutes. The Reverend Amos Kerr preached on the parable of the widow's mite, which is the sort of thing that happens in life and that nobody would dare put in a made-up story. He did not preach it at anybody. He had chosen the text on Tuesday. He was a decent, tired, badly paid man of 39, who rode a circuit of 3 congregations, and who had not been in the vestibule at 4 minutes past 10, and did not know that anything had happened. He read the verses about the rich men casting in of their abundance, and the poor widow casting in all the living that she had, and he said the ordinary true things a country preacher says about it. And 110 people sat in pews they had between $1 and $4 a year to occupy, and nobody laughed at all, and Hannah Ames sat on 14 inches at the back of the room with her daughter on her lap and listened to it with a completely still face. Elias Ward listened to the sermon and watched the back of that woman's head. He had noticed the coat. Everyone in the building had noticed the coat. That was the entire point of the morning. But Ward had been looking at working men's clothing for 35 years, and what he saw when he looked at that coat was not poverty. He saw a freighter's coat. He saw the cut of the skirt, which was long for a wagon box. He saw the double breast, which was for wind coming across open ground at a driving seat. He saw that it had been taken in at the shoulders by somebody who knew what she was doing, which meant it had been cut for a man, which meant the man was dead, because no woman in that country cuts down a living man's only coat. And Elias Ward, sitting in the last pew on the right with a saddlebag between his boots, thought about 11 pages into a subscription book he had read 4 nights before. He did not know. Let me be honest about this. He did not know it was the same family. Ames is not a rare name, and half the widows on that line were wearing their husbands' coats. He suspected, and he sat on the suspicion for the length of a sermon, and he did what a careful man does with a suspicion, which is nothing at all until he can check it. The sermon ended. They sang, and then the Reverend Kerr said what he said every second Sunday of the month, which was that the trustees would come forward for the building collection, because the interest on the note fell due at the end of November, and the pew rents were $7 short of it that year. Cyrus Bell rose from pew number 1. He was a tall man, and he had a good voice for a room, and he said what he always said, which was a short, sincere, well-meant word about the house they had raised out of nothing on a prairie where there was no wood, and how it stood as a witness to what people can do when they give. And Elias Ward stood up in the back. Deacon. 110 heads came around. Nobody stands up during the collection. In a country church in 1879, a stranger standing up during the collection was very nearly a physical event. "Sir," Bell said, "you are welcome here, but if you have business it can keep till after." "It can't, and I'll tell you why in a minute." Ward came out into the aisle with the saddlebag over his shoulder. "My name is Elias Ward. I'm from Topeka, and I run cattle in Barton and Rush counties. I've been on this line 19 days looking at security my bank took up in September, and this building is the last item on my list. Deacon, I hold your note. $640, and the interest you're collecting for right now is owed to me." You could have heard the stove. Bell recovered fast, because he was not a fool. "Then you are more than welcome, Mr. Ward, and you'll find this congregation has never missed a payment in 4 years. You haven't. That's why I'm going to make you an offer instead of a demand." Ward set the saddlebag on the end of pew number 4 and opened it. "But before I do, I've got a question for the trustees, and I want it answered in front of the room, because the answer is the whole reason I'm standing up." He took out a book. It was not large. It was a quarter-bound account book with a marbled cover and a broken corner, the kind of thing a man buys for 50 cents, and it was 6 years old, and it had been to Topeka and back in a saddlebag, and when Cyrus Bell saw it, the color went out of his face in a way that 110 people watched happen. "That was filed," Bell said. "It was. In 1875, with the note as evidence of subscription. My bank bought the note in September, and the file came with it." Ward held it up. "Deacon Bell, is this the original subscription book of this church?" Bell did not answer. "I'll take that as yes." Ward opened it. "There are 41 names in this book. There are 31 on the roll hanging in your vestibule, and I walked past that roll on my way in this morning and read every one of them. I'd like somebody to tell this congregation where the other 10 went." Nobody said anything. And then a man named Solomon Tarr, who farmed 6 miles east and who was 52 years old, and had said perhaps 400 words in that building in 6 years, stood up in pew number 11 and said, "I dug the footings." He sat down again immediately, the way a man does when the sentence has gotten out ahead of him. Then a man in the 14th row said, "I plastered it." Then somebody near the door said, "My father hauled the piers up from the Smoky Hill, and he's been dead since '78, and he ain't on that wall either." The room came apart, not into shouting, into that low, spreading, terrible sound of 100 people all realizing the same thing at the same moment, and none of them wanting to be the one who says it out loud. Cyrus Bell said, "The roll was subscribers to the building fund. It was a fund. It was money. There was no dishonesty in it, and any man who says there was—" "I haven't said there was," Ward said. "I want to read you page 11, and he read it. "F.M. Ames, have no money to give, will haul the lumber, all of it, from the road at Ellis, free, on my own teams, till the house is up or I am dead." He read it slowly, and he read it once, and then he closed the book and let it sit, in the last row on the left, on 14 inches of bench. Hannah Ames put her hand over her mouth and kept it there. Josie Ames, who was 9, stood straight up on the bench so she could see over the heads in front of her, and nobody told her to sit down. 22 trips, Elias Ward said. I've had it from 3 men in this county in the last hour of asking, and I'll have it from more if anybody wants to argue. 91 miles each way. He lost 3 head of oxen doing it, and replaced them out of his own pocket, and never sent a bill to this congregation. That is every board over your head this morning. That is the glass in those windows, and the shingles keeping the snow off your children, and the bell in that steeple. He turned and looked at the back of the room for the first time, and his widow just stood in your aisle for 40 seconds looking for somewhere she was allowed to sit. Cyrus Bell did not run. I will give him that much, and I will give him nothing else. He stood in front of pew number 1 with 110 people looking at him, and he made the only defense he had. And the terrible thing about it is that every word of it was true. I did not strike his name, he said. There was no name to strike. It was a list of the fund. He gave nothing to the fund. He gave a great deal, and I have never once said otherwise. And I have said from that pulpit that this house was hauled here by men who could not put $1 in a plate. But a roll of subscribers is a roll of subscribers, and a stationer letters what he is given. And I gave him the fund. Who decided it was a list of the fund? Ward asked. Bell stopped. That's the whole question, Deacon. Nobody handed you that rule. There was no roll before you made one. You sat down with a subscription book that had 41 names in it, and you decided which 10 of them didn't count. And you decided it in a way that put your own name at the top in the largest hand on the sheet. I'm not calling you a thief. I've been over your accounts twice this week, and there is not 1 cent out of place in them, and I'll say that to anybody who asks me. What I'm calling you is a man who built a wall and then hung a list on it of the people who paid for the wall, and left off the man who carried the wall here. That is not a crime. No, Ward said, it isn't. It's worse than that, because there's no law that ever going to reach it. And it's been hanging in your doorway for 3 years where his daughter could read it. And then Elias Ward did the thing he had come there to do, and he did it in about 90 seconds, which is all it takes when a man has already made up his mind on a 19-day ride. Here's my offer to this congregation. I hold $640 against this building at 10%. I will discharge it, today. Every cent of principal and interest paid off my own account, and I will send the satisfaction down from Topeka inside 2 weeks. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. On one condition, and it goes into the release and it gets recorded at the county with the deed, so that it binds this lot and this building, and every trustee who ever sits on this board after every man in this room is dead. There is never again a pew rent in this house. Not a letting, not a subscription for a seat, not a card in a frame, not 1 square foot of that floor with a price on it. It is a free church from this morning, or I keep the note and you go on paying me 10% until 1889. Nobody in the Pilot Grove Union Church had ever heard anything like that in their lives. It was not, I should say, an invention of Elias Ward's. The free church question was being fought out in congregations from Boston to Denver, all through the 1870s, and men had been arguing in print for 20 years that a rented pew was a contradiction sitting in the middle of a Christian building. What was unusual was not the idea. What was unusual was a man with the money to end the argument in one room in one morning, and the nerve to do it while everybody was still standing up. The Reverend Amos Kerr, who had been silent through all of it, said, "The trustees will have to put it to a vote." Then put it. He put it. It carried by a show of hands, and the count that Josie Ames wrote down in 1951 was 91 for and 6 against. And she noted that Cyrus Bell's hand was one of the 91. Then Solomon Tarr walked out the side door, went across the road to his wagon, came back with a screwdriver, and started at pew number 1. Nobody told him to. Nobody stopped him. He took the brass frame off the end of pew number 1, which was Cyrus Bell's, $4 the year, nearest the stove, and he took the card out of it, and he set the frame on the seat. Then he went to pew number 2. He was not a young man, and there were 34 frames, and each one had 2 screws in it, and it took him better than half an hour. And for the whole of that half hour 110 people stood around in a church in Kansas, in November, listening to a 52-year-old farmer unscrew brass, and not one of them left. Josie Ames wrote that it was the loveliest sound she ever heard in that building, and she heard 50 years of hymns in it. Now, here is the part where I have to be careful, because the version of this story people tell in that county has gotten a little smoother than the truth, and I would rather give you the truth. Cyrus Bell was not driven out of Pilot Grove that morning. Nobody shouted him down. Nobody put him on a wagon. What happened to Cyrus Bell was slower and much worse. He stayed. He stayed for 11 more years, in the same house with the same elevator and the same 4 notes on the same 4 farms, And he came to that church 3 times a week the way he always had, and he sat in the 4th row, because pew number 1 was not his anymore, and there was no way on this earth he was going to take it by simply walking to it. He resigned as deacon in January of 1880, and the congregation would not accept it, which sounds like forgiveness and was not. They would not accept it because half of them had been laughing on the 9th of November, and every one of them knew it. And letting Cyrus Bell resign would have been letting Cyrus Bell carry the whole morning out the door on his back. And there were enough decent people in that room to understand that would have been a lie. So he stayed, and every single Sunday for 11 years, he walked past the vestibule wall on the way in, because the dedication roll came down that day, and something else went up in its place. Elias Ward left the subscription book with the trustees. He did not have to. It was bank property, filed with a note that had a fortnight left to live, and he could have carried it back to Topeka, and nobody would ever have thought about it again. What he said, and Josie set it down in his words, was, "It's not mine. It was never the bank's." 41 people in this county wrote in that book with their own hands, and it should have come home in 1875. The trustees took page 11 out. That is the only piece of this story I have ever felt uneasy about, taking a leaf out of a book. But they did it, and they did it carefully with a knife along the gutter, and they had the stationer in Hayes mounted under glass in the same frame the dedication roll had hung in. They hung it in the vestibule, at a height a child could read. Ephraim Ames. Have no money to give. Will haul the lumber. All of it, from the road at Ellis, free on my own teams, till the house is up or I am dead. And underneath it, on a card lettered by the same stationer, the other 9 names, and what each of them had done, and no figures at all. Josie Ames was 9 years old on the 9th of November 1879, and she was the first person to read it, on the 16th, because they got the frame back from Hayes on the Thursday. She had been walking past that wall her whole life looking for her father, and on the 3rd Sunday in November of 1879, she stood in a cold vestibule in her knit hood and found him. Hannah Ames did one thing that morning that I think about more than anything else in this story. When the vote was over and the frames were coming off, and the room had gone loose and loud, a woman came down the aisle toward her. It was Mrs. Louisa Sprague, pew number 3, $4 the year, who had said the sentence about the draft and the coat, and she was crying in the ugly, honest way people cry when the thing they did has caught up with them in front of witnesses, and she got about 4 feet away and could not get anything out at all, and what Hannah Ames said was, "It's a very warm coat." That was it. That was the whole thing. She said it kindly, and she said it as a fact, and she did not say anything else, and Louisa Sprague went and sat down. I have turned that over for a long time. It would be a better story, in the cheap way, if Hannah Ames had said something that scorched the paint. She did not. She had spent 2.5 years being handled gently by people who felt bad about her, and she knew exactly what it does to a person to be somebody else's chance to feel better, and she was not going to hand that gift out on the morning it was finally her turn. She let the woman stay uncomfortable. She let it be unresolved. That is not forgiveness, and it is not revenge, and I think it is the most grown-up thing anybody does in this entire account. Elias Ward rode out of Pilot Grove on the 10th of November 1879, and he did not come back for 4 years. He did not offer Hannah Ames money. I want to be clear about that, because it is the thing people always expect, and it did not happen. He never gave her $1. What he did instead was this. On the way out of town he stopped at the elevator, and he found out what a freighting outfit could earn on the run from the railhead to the settlements. And in the spring of 1880, his cattle company put out a hauling contract for supply into 2 counties, and Hannah Ames bid on it like anybody else and got it, because she had 1 yoke of oxen, her husband's wagon, and the only complete set of freight route notes on that stretch of prairie, written out in a dead man's hand in a book she had never once thought of as valuable. She hired 2 men in 1881, 4 in 1883. By 1888 the Ames outfit ran 11 wagons out of the Ellis railhead, and Hannah Ames was, in the plain accounting of that county, a wealthy woman. She never moved out of the sod house. She built onto it twice and put a shingle roof over the whole thing in 1886, and she lived in it until she died in 1911, and people used to ask her why, and she used to say the walls were 2 feet thick, and she had never once been cold in it, which was true and was not the reason. She wore the coat until 1894. By then it had been mended, by her own count, 31 times, and there was very little of the original wool left in the body of it at all. And she finally put it away in a cedar chest, not because she was ashamed of it, but because a woman who owns 11 wagons and goes to Kansas City twice a year on business gets treated a particular way by railroad clerks when she shows up in it, And she got tired of the fight. Cyrus Bell died in 1891. 69 of the 91 families in that congregation came to the funeral, and Hannah Ames was one of them, and she sat near the front. There is no record of what she thought about it, and I am not going to invent one. Josie Ames married a doctor in 1893, and lived in Hutchinson and raised 4 children, and outlived every single person in this account. In 1951, when she was 81 years old, the Pilot Grove Union Church was 101 years short of nothing at all. The town had gone. It had 211 people in 1879, and it had 19 in 1951, and the church had held its last regular service in 1937. And the County Historical Society was putting out a pamphlet on abandoned churches of the western counties. And somebody wrote to the last living person who might remember anything. Josie Ames wrote back 11 pages. She wrote about the wood, and the 91 miles, and the 22 trips, and the day the frames came off the pews. She wrote the line about not being able to find one face, it was the room. She wrote down the count of the vote, and she wrote down what her mother said to Louisa Sprague. And she was careful, at 81, to write that Cyrus Bell did not steal anything from anybody, and that she wanted that understood. And she wrote, at the end, that when they closed the building in 1937, the trustees had taken 2 things out of it: the bell, which went to a church in Hayes, and a frame from the vestibule wall. That frame is in a county museum case in Kansas today, with the glass gone yellow at the edges, holding 1 leaf of ruled paper with a rusty stain along the torn gutter, written in a slow, heavy hand by a man who did not write often, and was determined to do it properly. And in the case beside it, folded, is a brown wool freighter's coat, with 31 patches on it. The card under the coat gives her name, and the years she lived, and 1 line about the freight company. The card under the paper does not explain anything at all. It just gives the page and the date, and lets you read it. And that's where we'll leave Hannah and Josie. In a warm sod house on hard Kansas ground with 11 wagons on the road, and nobody in that county ever again having to stand in an aisle and look for somewhere they were allowed to sit. I hope this trip back to 1879 let you step out of the everyday for a while and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know how you were listening today. Maybe with a cup of coffee, out on the porch, or settling in for a quiet evening. Drop a comment below, because I really do read every single one, and tell me honestly, did you work out what was in that saddlebag before he opened it? Let me know what country you're watching from as well. It always amazes me how far these old stories travel. If this one was worth your time, hitting like and subscribing makes a real difference. Thanks for spending this time with me today.